Good morning, everyone, and welcome to IGTV. And with us this morning is Mark Keppers, and Mark is going to be talking about when emergency planning and execution and media hype collide. Wow, we've got plenty of practical experience in that area. All right, Mark, go ahead. Take it away.
Good morning, Joe. Good morning, everyone. As we all kind of clean up from Irene, I started thinking about certain types of events and our response as information protection and security practitioners as we have disaster recovery plans and we have to help execute our organization's emergency plans. How does getting caught up in the hype and how does the information flow by media, public information source providers affect us? So with the aftermath of what essentially in the New York metro area had become a tropical storm Irene, there'd been a fair bit of argument about whether the media had overhyped the event and overhyped the risk associated with the storm. Doing a little bit of retrospect, the storm weakened as it came up the Atlantic coast of the U.S., and as it hit Manhattan and the surrounding New Jersey, New York, Connecticut areas, it did so as a tropical storm with a lot of damage and surge, but it wasn't a full Category 1 or Category 2 hurricane. So it's easy to conclude that with all the press about evacuations and get the hell off the beach and everything else, that the public sector was kind of crying wolf, and all the emergency response preparations, evacuations, closures, etc., were a little overcautious. And I personally believe that conclusion is most likely incorrect. And in some instances, those preparations, in retrospect, while weren't needed, were probably insufficient for the goals intended. And I got a couple of supporting points for that. If the storm had happened to miss North Carolina and Virginia and stayed off the coast on the ocean, it probably would have hit New York as a full Category 1, Category 2, maybe even Cat 3 hurricane. Wind, flood, and surge damage would have been significant. Flooding areas would have been much, much worse, especially on the shores of Long Island and New Jersey. And currently, even now, with just the tropical storm status, there are still some areas in New Jersey and New York without power and communication. And we're here a week later talking about this. Several areas in New York City, several boroughs, the schedule for public transportation shutdown was a smaller window than would have facilitated a mandatory evacuation order. In fact, a mandatory evacuation order for certain areas was given, and the window for public transportation was somewhere between 2 to 4 hours in certain areas. And for immobile people who actually rely on public transportation, that window probably wasn't large enough if they really had to get out. The other thing that kind of made things seem a lot better for the areas that were restored quickly, utilities, communications, and other providers scrambled to get outside state resources coming to the coast from basically Virginia up to New York to assist with the repairs. They had crews running from as far as Oklahoma in some cases to get to Virginia, and again, with that additional staffing to help restore services, it mitigated a lot of the power outages that we did see. So I want to talk about another big event that got a lot of media attention, Hurricane Katrina, because that gives us a very similar look at something that did happen, and we have a lot of post-document ability to look at how things went. So from a disaster recovery and emergency management perspective, how should we analyze Hurricane Katrina? The media reports and the common conventional wisdom, if you will, painted a very dire situation, and in many cases it was, and we had significant loss of life, and that the emergency response to Katrina was appallingly poor. But is that correct? Now, I grant you that I'll give you the caveat that from a media spectacle and public relations perspective, Katrina was actually a near perfect storm of media hype and actual storm. And almost every person of authority that we saw from federal, state, and local authorities did not really acquit themselves very well in front of the press and the media. The notable exception to that is Lieutenant General Russell Honore, who gave us the incredibly useful phrase, stuck on stupid. So what did the media get wrong as we go back and do kind of a post-mortem and lessons learned? The total number of fatalities for Katrina was about 1,600 persons. If you go back and look at NOAA and some other LSU computer simulations of the Katrina strength hurricane, they gave a worst case estimate of a death toll of over 60,000 people. So again, we had a couple orders of magnitude less than 60,000. A lot of that is due to rapid response. So, you had this media myth, and this is a good one, the Astrodome. If you looked at the news, you would think that the Astrodome was out of a Mad Max movie, that it had devolved into a chaotic pit of rape, murder, and violence. Well, in the harsh light of day, here we are later, you look at the total number of dead was 6, 4 from natural causes, 1 suicide, and 1 drug overdose. There was 1 attempted rape, which was stopped by the New Orleans police, and they arrested the attacker. There was 1 weapons discharge, and that was accidental by a National Guardsman, and they accounted for that. So, again, what the media portrayed in the Astrodome wasn't actually the case. Likewise, the response to Katrina by the federal government and other emergency services providers was needlessly slow and sluggish. Again, if you go back and look at actually what had happened, the response to Katrina was the largest and fastest rescue effort in U.S. history. FEMA beat their average numbers of being on site. Certainly the previous storm Andrew in Florida, it took them about 4 weeks to get operational. FEMA was on the ground after Katrina within a week, and they were starting to be more effective within 2 weeks, as well as the Coast Guard, the Navy, and other National Guard in the region. Within the first week, they had 50,000 National Guard on the Gulf Coast region who had saved about 17,000 people, and about 4,000 Coast Guard personnel had saved more than 33,000. Navy ships providing, clean water, hospital, and communication with the aircraft carriers and the baton that they brought into the theater. The other thing that Katrina gets a bad rap on is failure to evacuate appropriately and quickly. When the voluntary evacuation order was given, they basically shut down sections of inbound highway and turned them into outbound highway. So basically they reversed the flow of traffic. And that allowed about 1.2 million people out of 1.5 to get out of New Orleans. And according to Brian Wilson, who is an LSU civil engineer, they estimated that they would need 72 hours to evacuate that many people. Instead, it took 38 hours. So later investigations showed that many of the people who stayed mostly did so by choice. The tragic exceptions, and this made up a lot of the fatalities, were hospital patients, people in nursing homes, and other poor and infirm people who didn't have access to transportation. So how does the Katrina phenomena affect us in what we do? Well, when we're in an emergency and we rely on outside information to help us make decisions, we have to be able to verify that the story that we're getting is correct, especially if you're in the public sector and providing critical response, or you're in a critical response sector if you're a private organization and you're responsible for critical infrastructure. So because of poor communications during disasters, you have general issues with interagency and service communication anyway. So if you rely on the media and you're relying on, cable news for information, you kind of have to change your mindset about what you see and make sure that you take into account, the kind of the hype monster. So one of the real lessons learned from Katrina from that, and this is the thing that I want to drive home because it's important and it illustrates the danger of how the media can shape events as they're happening, is that because of the widespread reports of violence, roving gangs, and snipers, rescue efforts were halted because it was felt that there was inadequate force protection for the rescuers. So you couldn't ensure the safety of the rescuers, so the National Guard had to go out with the rescues to provide force protection. This resulted in an increased level of fatalities because you couldn't just send the rescue workers out to the maximum number of people they could. You had to wait until they could get force protection. And so that delayed a lot of things. And then if you look at the actual stats, according to Captain Marlon DeFillo of the New Orleans Police Department's Public Affairs Group, there were no killings, not a single murder, and no sniper fire. There was never a bullet hole found on the fuselage of any rescue helicopter or boat. So that media hype cost lives. So what are the lessons that we learn here? If you understand the difference between the things that you actually know and can validate to a high degree of decimal points versus the things that you are, and you may have to be, taking on faith, either by news or by secondhand reports, try to understand how much faith is involved, what that leap of faith is, so to speak, and what the potential margin of errors are, and what the other possible scenarios are, and how you might validate what your situation is. Be cautious about using uncorroborated media coverage as an input to significant decision points, especially around evacuation and launching disaster recovery sites and things like that. Try to use multiple sources of information. Use authoritative sources of information. If we're talking about weather, NOAA, DHS, and actually a lot of state DHS and emergency services will have links to their evacuation plans and will have public statements about where they are in their decision processes. Make sure that you corroborate what you're doing and how your plans interact with those. So also try to corroborate with what you were seeing and hearing with other new media sources. There was a really interesting article in Wall Street Journal last few days, and I'll put it on the links, and it was how FEMA has a classic storm strength index that they use, that we all know, Category 4, Category 5, etc. But they also have a couple of unofficial ones that they use as sort of a benchmark of how bad the storm actually was. And it's called the Waffle House Index. And for people who don't spend a lot of time south of the Mason-Dixon line, Waffle House is a big chain of kind of a 24-hour diner-like breakfast place at about every truck stop and interstate intersection all over the South and West. And what they have found is if you can figure out to the degree to which the local Waffle House is operating, that'll give you an indication about how bad the storm is hit. Because they have generators, so if the restaurant is completely open and you have all the items on the menu, everything's mostly okay, you've got minor damage. If they're running on generator power and they only have a partial menu, things are probably bad, but in some sort of recovery state or in a state that you can operate a recovery practice. If the Waffle House is closed, you've got a genuine disaster on your hands. So likewise, you can use new media. You can use bloggers. Obviously, you need to check their veracity and see what their sources are. But sometimes bloggers and other people on the ground are much better than some of the camera crews frantically running around in vans. As a contrary step back to that, you also have to be mindful that as we look at worst case scenarios like Irene could have been much, much worse. So be realistic, but be aware that worst case scenarios can happen and be prepared. Some other things to consider when developing your plans: consider what other factors are going to impact you, how the various other entities, government, utility, communications, how their response plans are going to intersect and in some cases might preempt your plans. If a government issued a mandatory evacuation order, would that preempt your disaster plan if you were planning to man a critical facility with a skeleton crew? How do you get those two things to coexist? Have you reviewed the local area evacuation and response plans, and does it affect your supply chain, deliveries, etc.? And does it affect how you egress as well? Review your and this is important, review your emergency communication strategies to ensure that if whatever normal means of communication you have alternate means and out-of-band means to carry out your command and control and carry out your plans. So if your communications goes down, you got to be able to have an alternate means of communication, not only internally, but with any resources that you rely on and will be interacting to during and after that emergency or disaster. So make sure you develop a contact list for local authorities. Make sure your people have that list and it's distributed. Make sure the authorities and local utilities are all listed. And as an extra step, you probably want to go to the step of actually introducing yourself to these resources before the disaster strike. If you got some downtime, make sure you this is critical in a lot of areas for information security. Make sure you get to know a lot of the local government and utility and your service providers, and make sure they know who you are. So in the midst of the chaos, when you call and say, hey, it's me, I called you 2 months ago, and here we are now, let's work together. And it's not, they're going to be responding to all the chaos that they need to, and it's much easier if you have that foot in the door already and have a relationship already to say, hey, this is what we're going through. We might need some help. I want to know where you're at, and here's where I'm at. Make sure you have a plan. Make sure you communicate your plan ahead of time. And, as no plan survives contact with the enemy, if events overtake your plan, make sure you have means of communicating and synchronizing the actions and the changes in plan that you may need to take on the fly as well. And that's pretty much how to avoid colliding with event and media hype during your emergency. Joe?
Mark, that was good.